December 20th, 1944. Noville, Belgium. A thin blanket of fog clings to the frozen fields northeast of Bastogne, and through it, barely visible, come the shapes of tanks. Not American tanks. The lead vehicles of the 2nd Panzer Division are rolling forward in the pre-dawn gloom, their commanders confident that nothing standing between them and the vital road junction to the south can hold for long. They are, in the main, correct. What little stands in their way is a scratch force of paratroopers without armor of their own, dug into a town they were never meant to defend, waiting for support that has not yet arrived. Then it arrives. A single platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, thin-skinned and lightly built, comes rattling up the icy road from Bastogne at a speed no German tank can match. They belong to the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and within the hour they will help account for roughly 30 German armored vehicles in the fighting around Noville, a figure that would be extraordinary for a full battalion, let alone a single platoon. It is the opening act in what will become, over the following week, one of the most consequential defensive stands of the Second World War in the West, and the 705th will be there for nearly all of it, providing the bulk of the armored firepower available to an entire airborne division. To understand why a battalion built around lightly armored, thinly protected vehicles ended up as the difference between Bastogne holding and Bastogne falling, you have to go back 3 years, to a training ground in Kentucky, and to a doctrine born of desperation. The United States Army entered its tank destroyer program in 1941 with a problem it had not yet fully solved and a philosophy it had not yet fully tested. German panzer divisions had swept through Poland, the Low Countries, and France with a speed and coordination that terrified American observers. The lesson drawn, rightly or wrongly, was that no static defense could stop a concentrated armored thrust, and that the answer was not heavier tanks of their own, but dedicated hunter formations, built for speed, built to swarm forward, strike, and withdraw before the enemy could bring superior numbers to bear. Out of this thinking came the Tank Destroyer Force, and among its earliest units was a battalion raised at Fort Knox in December 1941, built from an artillery cadre pulled out of the 5th Armored Division. This was the 705th. This matters because the vehicle the doctrine eventually produced, and the battalion that would carry it into Belgium 3 years later, were shaped entirely by that founding gamble, that speed could substitute for armor, and that a crew willing to close with the enemy from an angle he did not expect could beat machines that outweighed and outgunned them on paper. By the 5th winter of the war in Europe, the problem the Allies faced had inverted itself entirely. It was no longer the Germans who held the advantage in armor doctrine, but the Germans who had run out of nearly everything else. Adolf Hitler's gamble in the Ardennes, launched on December 16, 1944, depended on speed of a different kind, a narrow window in which fog and low cloud would ground Allied air power before American reinforcements could concentrate and before fuel stocks, chronically short across the German war economy, ran dry. The plan required armored spearheads to punch through a lightly held stretch of the American line, seize the road network running through the Ardennes, and reach the Meuse before the weather cleared. Bastogne sat squarely across that road network. 7 main routes converged on the small Belgian town, and whichever army controlled it controlled the tempo of the entire offensive. The Germans could not simply go around it. The roads did not allow it, not at the pace they needed. And yet the town's defenders, when the siege properly began, amounted to little more than the scattered elements of the 101st Airborne Division, rushed into position without their own organic armor, without adequate winter clothing, and increasingly without enough ammunition, encircled within days by elements of 5 German divisions. On paper, it should not have held. The 101st Airborne, for all its reputation, was an infantry formation. It possessed no tank battalion of its own, and its men had been rushed to Bastogne in such haste that many arrived without adequate winter boots, without sufficient ammunition reserves, and in some cases without their full complement of weapons at all, having been pulled straight from a rest period near Reims rather than from a fully equipped staging area. Against it were ranged elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzerlehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, backed by the kind of armor the Americans had already learned to respect and fear in roughly equal measure. The Panther, what tipped the balance and what made the difference between an infantry division fighting encircled with no answer to German armor and an infantry division that could actually hold ground against it, was the addition of a single tank destroyer battalion, formally attached to the 101st Airborne on December 20th, the same day the ring around the town closed. That battalion was the 705th, and it would end up providing, in the words of the division's own after-action accounting, a major part of its combat capability for the remainder of the siege. The M18 Hellcat, the vehicle the battalion carried into Belgium, was an odd answer to the problem of German armor, and a deliberately odd one. It weighed around 18 tons, roughly half the weight of the Panther it was built to fight, and its armor, at its thickest, measured barely 25 millimeters, about the thickness of a heavy oak door, and considerably less at the sides and rear. No sane engineer would have called this survivable against a Panther's long-barreled 75mm gun, and it was not meant to be. The entire design philosophy of the Hellcat sacrificed protection for velocity. Powered by a Continental radial engine originally built for aircraft, the same family of engine that powered contemporary training planes, the Hellcat could reach speeds approaching 80 kilometers an hour on a good road, making it comfortably the fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle fielded by any nation during the war. To put that in perspective, a Sherman tank of the same period struggled to exceed 50 kilometers an hour, and the Panther, for all its firepower, rarely managed much more than that either, particularly across the broken, frozen ground of the Ardennes in December. Built by the Buick Motor Division of General Motors in Flint, Michigan, the Hellcat entered production in 1943 and reached frontline units in useful numbers through 1944, though exact production figures remain somewhat contested between sources, with most reputable estimates settling on around 2,500 built by war's end. Its crew of 5 sat inside an open-topped turret, a decision that saved weight and improved visibility at the cost of leaving the men inside exposed to shrapnel, small arms fire, and the bitter Ardennes winter alike. Its main armament, a 76mm gun, was not dramatically more powerful than the guns fitted to standard American Sherman tanks by late 1944, but paired with the newly available high-velocity, tungsten-cored ammunition arriving in limited quantities. That autumn, it could, at the right range and the right angle, punch through the side and rear armor of a Panther that would have simply deflected the same round off its glacis plate. The tactic this vehicle was built to execute, and the tactic the 705th's crews had drilled since Kentucky, was not to stand and trade shots. It was to use speed to reach a flanking position before the enemy tank commander had finished traversing his own turret, fire into the thinner side armor, and if the shot missed or failed to penetrate, to already be moving again before a reply came. It was, in effect, a doctrine that treated the tank destroyer less like a tank and more like a naval torpedo boat, built to strike from an angle a larger vessel could not easily bring its guns to bear on, and to survive by never staying still long enough to be hit. At Nouville, on the morning of December 20th, this doctrine was tested in close to its purest form. A single platoon of the 705th, sent north from Bastogne alongside a battalion of paratroopers to reinforce the hard-pressed defenders of Task Force de Sobry, arrived in time to blunt the leading edge of a 2nd Panzer Division assault, fighting through fog that limited visibility to a few hundred meters, in conditions that favored the defenders' ability to appear and disappear as much as it favored the attackers' numbers. That single platoon is credited with helping account for roughly 30 German armored vehicles in the fighting around the town, a remarkable tally for so few crews and so few guns. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The action at Nouville was only the opening chapter. As the siege proper developed and the perimeter around Bastogne tightened, The battalion was broken up and distributed across the town's defenses in a manner that speaks to just how thinly the available armor had to be stretched. By December 24th, individual platoons of the 705th had been assigned out to nearly every infantry regiment holding the line: 1 platoon to the 501st Parachute Infantry, 2 to the 506th, 2 to the 502nd, and 4 to the 327th Glider Infantry, with the final platoon held back in reserve within the town itself. This was not concentration of force in any conventional sense. It was dispersal born of necessity, a handful of tank destroyers spread thin enough to give every threatened sector at least some answer to German armor, rather than allowing any one sector the luxury of overwhelming support. Compare this with how the German army approached the same problem in the same battle. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads around Bastogne, built around Panther and King Tiger battalions, were designed to concentrate mass and firepower at a single point of breakthrough, then exploit the gap before the defenders could react. It was a doctrine that had worked spectacularly in 1940. By December 1944, it required fuel. The German war machine increasingly did not have, and it required exactly the kind of open, decisive, tank-on-tank engagement that let a Panther's superior armor and gun tell. What it did not account for was an opponent who refused to fight that engagement on those terms, who instead scattered small, fast, expendable detachments across every likely approach and traded concentrated strength for coverage. The Americans could not have won a straight tank duel with the Panthers ranged against Bastogne. They did not attempt one. The comparison with other Allied forces is instructive, too. British and Commonwealth tank destroyer doctrine, embodied in vehicles like the Archer and the towed 17-pounder anti-tank gun, leaned toward ambush from prepared, static positions rather than mobile flanking, prioritizing a devastating first shot over subsequent repositioning. It was, in its own context, a sound approach, and the 17-pounder in particular could punch through a Panther's frontal armor at ranges the American 76mm gun struggled to match. But it was not an approach available to the defenders of an encircled town under attack from multiple directions simultaneously, where no single prepared ambush position could cover every likely axis of advance, and where the garrison lacked the days of preparation that static anti-tank doctrine generally assumed. Other American tank destroyer battalions fighting elsewhere on the Western Front in the same weeks offer a further point of comparison. Several units, still equipped with the older, heavier M10 Wolverine, mounting a lower-velocity 76mm gun in a fully enclosed turret, found themselves better protected against shell splinters and small arms fire than the open-topped Hellcat crews, but markedly slower and less able to reposition once committed to a fight. Some towed tank destroyer battalions, stripped of their vehicles entirely and reduced to hauling anti-tank guns behind lorries, suffered badly in the Ardennes, fighting precisely because they could not withdraw a compromised position quickly enough once German infantry closed in, a vulnerability the 705th's self-propelled Hellcats did not share. The battalion's mobile, dispersed employment across Bastogne, however improvised in the moment it was ordered, was arguably better suited to the specific and unusual demands of an encircled perimeter than the German concentration doctrine, the more static British model, or the American Army's own towed alternative. None of this is to overstate what a single battalion, however well handled, could achieve against the sheer weight of the German offensive. Records of the fighting inside Bastogne itself remain patchy in places, compiled after the fact from unit diaries, veteran testimony, and after-action reports written by exhausted officers in the days immediately following the siege's relief, and precise, verified tallies of vehicles destroyed by individual platoons across the full week of fighting have not survived in a form historians can fully reconcile. What is well documented and not seriously disputed is the scale of the sacrifice involved. Of the roughly 48 men the 705th lost across its entire year of combat in Europe, 30 were killed in the defense of Bastogne alone, a casualty rate that speaks to just how exposed those open-topped, thinly armored vehicles were, even as they succeeded in their task. The impact of the battalion's stand extends beyond the tactical tally of tanks destroyed, however uncertain some of those figures remain. Psychologically, the presence of American armor, however outmatched on paper, denied German commanders the uncontested freedom of maneuver their doctrine depended on. Every advance had to be made with the possibility of a flanking shot from ground that looked, at a glance, entirely undefended. That uncertainty cost the attackers time, and time was the one resource Hitler's Ardennes gamble could least afford to lose. By the time General George Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the town on December 26th, the German offensive had already missed its planned schedule by days that would prove impossible to recover, and the wider battle, though it would grind on into January, had effectively lost its momentum.